Hey everyone, my name's Steve, and I'm a regulated Canadian immigration consultant. And on my channel, I talked about the enhancing express entry through category based selection to better meet Canada's evolving economic needs. Basically, an online consultation process that IRCC made available to essentially anyone. They do ask for an organization. So I'm going through this. I'm going to show you guys my answers, what I think they should do to improve express entry, to solve labor shortages, to improve transitions for students to permanent residents. And I will gladly share with you all my answers so you know where I stand. I definitely represent business. I represent an immigration consultant or lawyer. And that's pretty much it. I would consider myself a national organization, but I mostly do work in BC, Alberta, and Ontario. And I have all these answers ready. So selecting candidates. Selecting on the basis of work experience and occupations or sectors is a way to improve the competitiveness. According to Statistics Canada, I have this here. The most acute skilled shortages are found in construction, trades, administrative and support, waste management, and remediation, and other services, with the exception of public administration. Are these areas of concern to your organization? Are there any other occupations or sectors experiencing chronic and long-term needs that you could identify, and for which permanent residents through express entry can complement in Canada solutions such as better wages, working conditions, skills, upgrading, and improving productivity? For each identified occupation or sector, we would also appreciate considerations on numbers, including data. How might solutions incorporate equity considerations? So this is my response to that. It's a pretty open-ended one here, but there you are. It is best for provinces to select candidates based on their work experience in a specific occupation or sector because they have a better understanding of the labor needs of their province. I'm a big fan, as many of you may know, of provincial nominee express entry programs. When the provincial officers do the basically the nomination process, they check the eligibility of the applicant, and then it's very little work for IRCC. They're just doing criminality and medical admissibility, and then that's it. PNP Express Entry are some of the fastest applications I've ever seen processed. So this is particularly important for sectors that experience chronic and long-term shortages, such as the healthcare system in Alberta. For example, one solution to address acute labor shortages is to grant open work permits through programs like International Experience Class, rather than relying on the lengthy and cumbersome labor market impact assessment process. I would like to see variations of the International Experience Class be granted and applied to applicants and workers from visa-required countries. In order to make the temporary resident program more efficient, work permit processing times must be happening in weeks rather than months or years. Interim authorization from regulatory bodies should also be considered to allow workers, such as nurses, to come to Canada and begin the credentialing process while they are in the country and while they are working. That's a really big barrier to a lot of these regulated professions. To address chronic labor shortages that persist, provincial nominee programs are the best solution because they are more efficient at determining the labor needs of the province. In order to create an equitable system, barriers to achieving permanent residence should be reduced. One such barrier that I've noticed as a consultant and many of my colleagues is the illegal practice of some employers charging high fees for LMIA-supported job offers, which are necessary in many cases for a provincial nominee express entry nomination because they're considered a job offer, or to receive points for arranged employment. By eliminating this option and focusing on the candidate's real experience and the occupation they are working in, we can ensure a fair and effective system for addressing labor shortages in Canada. It's important to have an equitable system in place to reduce barriers to achieving permanent residence. One barrier is finding an employer that's willing to provide an LMIA-supported job offer, even if the applicant is already working in Canada on a post-graduation work permit, for example, and has studied in Canada. This can be difficult because a large minority of employers unlawfully charge high fees for these offers, which is illegal. These fees can create an express entry nomination and provide additional points for arranged employment. As I've said before, to address this issue, we should defer points considered for arranged employment until after the applicant has worked at least 1 year for the company and focus on the candidate's real experience in the occupation they're working in. This would create a more fair and effective system for addressing labor shortages in Canada. So to clarify that, I'd like to also add here, I believe in the ability for arranged employment to count as 50 or 200 points after 1 year of working with the same employer, even if the applicant is on an open work permit. I believe that. I don't think they need to be on a closed work permit. I think after 1 year of working for the same employer full time, if you can prove that, they should be able to claim 50 or 200 points. That's considered arranged employment. This would be depending on, and the job they are working in is full time and permanent. Permanent with an indeterminate, let's say, length. So that basically means a full-time permanent job. I think in that case, that should count as 50 points. If you've been working for an employer for 1 year, that's just as good as an LMIA. Why go through the rigmarole of a 3 to 4 month process of the LMIA, making the employer do that? Clearly, they're filling a labor shortage if they're already working for that employer on an open work permit. So transitioning international student graduates, yes, I believe we want to increase international students that transition to permanent residence. And I've explained why here. It is often a good idea. Let me post this in and we can read it through it. It is often a good idea to increase the number of students transitioning to permanent residence in order to address labor shortages in Canada. This is because when students come to Canada to study, they have the opportunity to learn about Canadian culture, work part-time in the labor market, improve their English or French skills, make connections and network, and explore different parts of the country to determine where they might want to settle and where they're most needed. This creates a smooth introduction to Canada and helps to determine whether or not they will be good economic immigrants. Kind of like a try before you buy type scenario. I believe that a student to PR pathway and working to PR pathway are very important for Canada, both which should be heavily favored as CRS points in new ministerial instructions. The best way to integrate in Canadian society is through a staged approach, such as first studying or working in Canada and then being able to immigrate. However, the current system for arranged employment, which provides 50 or 200 points in the express entry system, or helps trigger an invitation to apply for a provincial nominee program, is being abused by consultants and lawyers who charge illegal fees for job offers. This creates a financial incentive for employers to participate in this fraud and makes it difficult for genuine, hardworking candidates to succeed. To address this issue, the LMI process should be used only to address complex labor shortages that require a company to apply for one, and the financial incentive charging for a job offer should be greatly reduced by only considering points for arranged employment after having worked for 1 year for that employer. When considering which programs and degrees are most useful for addressing labor shortages, it is important to consider the specific needs of the job market and the ability of the candidate to contribute to the shortage. For example, a degree in software engineering may be more in demand than a degree in basket weaving, but that does not mean that someone with a degree in basket weaving cannot be an economic success in Canada. Factors such as the candidate's communication skills, work ethic, and their current or past contribution to labor shortages through the Canadian Experience class should be considered. While it is true that immigration, refugees, and citizenship allows students to work full-time to address labor needs, I do not necessarily think this is the best approach. Encouraging students to study and work part-time only allows them to fully immerse themselves in their studies while also gaining valuable work experience. Working full-time may distract from their studies and may not provide the same benefits in terms of cultural integration and networking. So I'm referring to the new public policy that allows students to work full-time. I don't think that's a good move. What are the most important considerations to take into account when defining categories for selection for international students? In your response, you might wish to consider sectors or occupations with the most critical needs, recent work experience in Canada, or recent Canadian credentials from a designated learning institution. Whether international students with limited or no Canadian work experience should be considered for eligibility, and any considerations with respect to numbers in this category, for example. Well, I will say that I've written a lengthy response for this as well. I might want to add a few things to it, but when looking to important considerations for international students, it is more important to consider what they have done with their education and work experience rather than the specific subject matter of their studies. On a side note, I studied engineering. I don't work as an engineer. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an immigration consultant. My girlfriend, her first degree was in biology, and her second degree was an accelerated degree in nursing. So people switch up what they learned in university and then what they then put into practice. So this is why I say, while school can provide valuable skills such as the ability to study, think critically, live independently, people often take different career paths that may not be directly related to their studies. In sectors or occupations with critical needs, recent Canadian work experience may be more important than a Canadian credential. For example, an applicant who has a 2-year administration diploma only, but is working 3 jobs in a high demand sector, should be supported by our immigration system. To address the current challenges with the acute labor shortage, it is important to resolve temporary resident applications in a short amount of time. I do believe in heavily using the temporary resident program for acute labor shortages. This can be achieved by rapidly processing work permit applications regardless of whether the applicant is from a visa required country or not. To speed up this process, there should be options for the employer or applicant to pay for expedited processing within a 2-week time frame. Currently, IRCC is not moving at the speed of business, and processing times for work permits in many countries, including Pakistan, are outrageously high, over 1 year. It is essential for the government to get serious about reducing temporary resident processing times to improve the efficiency of the system. Is there any other feedback you'd like to provide about students, selecting international students? Yes, I believe I have this here. It is, when selecting international students in the express entry system, it is important to consider their Canadian work experience as well as length of their study program and how long they've been in Canada. Recent Canadian experience is a valuable factor in determining whether or not a student is competitive for permanent residence. The current system, which includes the freezing of the express entry pool and the extension of labor market impact assessments from 6 months to 18 months, can create disadvantages for those who do not have arranged employment or those who paid a consultant for an LMIA. Instead of focusing on promises made for the future, the immigration system should look at the applicant's history in Canada, which should be established over their PGWP and their potential for success as a permanent resident. Factors such as the applicant's job skills, tier code, and the vacancy rate in their field that they're in, and their rate of pay can help to distinguish who is more competitive at the PR stage. It is important to favor immigrants who are paid higher wages in order to maintain high wages in Canada and avoid using international students as cheap labor. Transitioning temporary foreign workers. I believe there's a strong positive impact when we transition temporary foreign workers to permanent residents. I've said before, I am heavily in favor of TR to PR. I believe in some cases it's important for people to land as permanent residents, like federal skilled worker. But in many cases, I believe the best immigrants from what I've seen are the ones who have a gradual integration in a temporary resident to permanent resident pathway. So we'll see that here. Recognizing existing provincial, territorial, and federal programs that support the transition of TFWs to permanent residents. Please provide details on why increasing transitions through express entry would not help in responding to needs. Are there any gaps that need to be addressed? Well, I have this here. I do believe fully in, when addressing labor market needs specifically for particular occupations, the best and brightest economic immigrants, one effective pathway is the Provincial Nominee Program Express Entry, PNP Express Entry, which allows provinces to nominate immigrants based on their economic needs. However, the current system of awarding points for arranged employment again creates barriers to those who cannot afford to pay for an expensive labor market impact or who do not have arranged employment. I also want to mention it's not just that consultants and lawyers are charging large amounts for LMIAs. There are some companies, large corporations, that refuse to go through this process. So let's say somebody's working at a bank. They're filling a labor shortage at a bank. Banks rarely do LMIAs. So this can lead to the selection of immigrants based on their ability to pay rather than their experience working in Canada. I believe the best gap to address in this case would be to allow points for arranged employment to be considered after 1 year of working for an employer full-time, whether or not the applicant is on a closed or open work permit. That should not matter. As long as the employment is permanent and full-time, I believe it should constitute as arranged employment. So what I'm saying here, to simplify, is you should be able to claim 50 or 200 points if you've been working for more than 1 year of full-time in a skilled occupation for an employer, for one employer. I think that is very important, even if you're on an open work permit. So students that have a PGWP, then they spend 2 years working for an employer, they should be able to constitute that as arranged employment. That's as long as it's a permanent, indeterminate job offer, right? That they're working for that employer continuously on a permanent basis. What are the most important considerations to take into account when defining categories for selection of temporary foreign workers? Are there needs in specific areas, skill sets that could be met by increasing transitions of temporary foreign workers, permanent residents to express entry? In your response, you may wish to comment on chronic and long-term needs that cannot be solved through in-Canada solutions, such as better wages. You may also wish to comment on whether to focus on workers who are in Canada versus those with recent experience who may or may not currently reside in the country, as well as implications from a diversity and anti-racism perspective. We welcome any considerations with respect to numbers. Well, I kept this pretty short, but I believe the main barrier isn't believe it or not, it's not IRCC in this case, it's the regulatory bodies. So to address the shortages in certain industries such as healthcare, it's important to reduce the barriers created by regulatory bodies. These bodies can take up to 2 years to evaluate an applicant's credentials, which can create delays in the immigration process. To encourage more people to immigrate and solve these shortages, it is necessary to have a standard work permit processing time of 60 days for both visa-required and visa-exempt countries. This standard should apply to all applicants regardless of nationality to ensure a fair and anti-racist immigration system. It is also important to have an option for applicants to work on an open but occupation-specific work permit for 2 years in Canada under the supervision of licensed Canadian professionals in order to gain experience and integrate into the Canadian society. This interim authorization process can help to reduce the reliance on the LMIA process and solve acute labor shortages more efficiently by allowing these applicants to work for multiple employers. Additionally, the regulatory bodies must be held to a higher standard and rapid credentialing process, allowing people to work as residents or interns or apprentices under the supervision of licensed, regulated professionals. So what I'm getting at here and what I want to simplify is that if you want to immigrate to Canada as a nurse, you need to be and get a job offer as a nurse and work for AHS or any hospital. You need to first be licensed by the College of Nurses. To be licensed by the College of Nurses, you need to be a permanent resident or you need to do a 1.5 years of credentialing. So you kind of need to be in Canada first. They should switch it up. Like you should be able to come to Canada on a 2-year open work permit, but that is occupation specific in nursing, and then have some restrictions on your profession where, you need to be supervised for 6 months. They've evaluated your credentials in 2 months. Okay, you have the potential to become a nurse. Now you've got to do some practical training and internship. That's how it should be. We should be able to immigrate people. I'm going to put this in here. We should be able to immigrate people to Canada as interns and apprentices with fast regulatory body credentialing, right? Because we always talk about this issue in Canada, we have cardiologists driving taxi cabs. And that's why, because sometimes it might be easier to immigrate as a delivery driver than it is to immigrate as a cardiologist, because, you need to get licensed by the provincial board of doctors or whatever it would be, physicians, regulating organizations. So you want people to be able to come here maybe for 2 years on an open work permit to practice as a resident once they've gotten their credentials, evaluated. And the credential evaluation needs to happen in a much shorter period of time, not 1.5 years. It needs to be in like 60 days. You're just evaluating their credentials. You're just looking at a WES report, at exams that they can take. And they should be able to take these exams monthly if they need to, and remotely. So these are the kind of things we need to put a lot of pressure on these regulatory bodies to simplify this process. Is there any other feedback you'd like to provide about selecting temporary foreign workers? Here we go. It is important to consider the work experience and contributions of temporary foreign workers when selecting them for permanent residence through the express entry system, rather than focusing on points for arranged employment at the beginning of the process, which I believe should be claimed by an applicant with over 1 year of permanent full-time work experience with the same employer. It may be more effective to prioritize applicants who have a history of working and living in Canada. This could include factors such as number of hours worked, wages earned, taxes paid. The approach would place more emphasis on the actual contributions and experience of the applicant and history of the applicant, rather than creating a market for fraud and exorbitant job offer fees. It would also reduce the burden on enforcement and temporary foreign worker integrity, as it would be less reliant on the LMIA process. We are interested in your views on whether a category designed to select on the basis of French language proficiency could help fill labor shortage demands in Francophone minority communities. To what extent would the further promotion of Francophone immigration through express entry help address economic needs? I believe there's no impact. And here's why. The point of express entry is for if someone can become economically established in Canada as a country. And we're a very diverse country. So it's more effective to focus on promoting Francophone immigration through provincial programs rather than a federal program, as the language needs and cultural considerations may vary by province. For example, the importance of French language skills may be, well, not maybe, most definitely is greater in Quebec and New Brunswick as opposed to Saskatchewan or Alberta when it comes to settling economically, becoming economically established. It may also be beneficial to consider cultural and language skills in municipal nomination programs, as this could allow for a more decentralized approach to immigration that takes into account the specific needs and preferences of different communities. And here, what are the most important considerations? I would just say I basically merged these together because I didn't want to elaborate too much on this. I think it really shouldn't be a federally administered, especially with, you're not even allowed to reside in Quebec. And when you look at what express entry is supposed to achieve, it's supposed to bring the best and brightest economic immigrants. It's not supposed to have so much cultural consideration. I think that is much better done in provincial nomination programs. And additionally, as I mentioned, I like a lot of emphasis on work experience. If the employer likes the fact that that's a Francophone person working and they need Francophone speakers, that will be reflected in their work experience, right? So that's what I think we should be basing it on, not on so much, let's say, book smart type things on what their English and French skills are, but rather on what have they done in Canada, right? Because what they've done in Canada will prove their potential for the future. I put here, beyond the proposed priorities, what are other economic objectives that could be met via category-based selection under express entry? I believe that the Canadian Experience Class is an effective way to encourage the successful integration of applicants into Canada. The selection criteria for this program should heavily consider an applicant's work experience, including the specifics of the jobs they hold. Express entry is an effective way to identify individuals who are already economically established in Canada or have the potential to be. I also believe that the requirement for work experience to not be self-employed is outdated for Canadian work experience. It should be possible for self-employed applicants to earn points based on the amount of work they do, as demonstrated through tax documents and other reliable evidence. This would allow young students and graduates who may have started their own business with a Canadian partner to be eligible for express entry, even if they are working and potentially creating jobs for other Canadians and permanent residents. As you may know, I'm a big fan of business immigration. That is my favorite field of immigration and favorite area to practice in. I love entrepreneurs. I love small business. I'm an entrepreneur myself. So I resonate with that. And that's how I got into immigration. It's my background, it's everything. I love entrepreneurs. They're job creators, they're the backbone of this country. I would love to see them remove that requirement that you cannot claim work experience if you're self-employed. You should be able to, as long as you can prove that it is bona fide, genuine, good work experience. Okay? Are there any other ways to improve equitable access? I think here we go. Again, I've mentioned this a few times today, but I think that's why the scores are so high. To improve access to permanent residence opportunities through express entry, it's important to base scores on factors that cannot be purchased. Instead of awarding points for arranged employment at the beginning of a potential job, it would be more effective to consider an applicant's work history in Canada, including their studies and length of time as a temporary resident. I think that's important too. If someone's been here for 10 years, even if they're in, low wage jobs and only have a 2-year and their English isn't too great, they've contributed a lot to the Canadian system. Their current employment and occupation and their employment history and hours worked. This will provide a more accurate picture of an applicant's potential for economic establishment in Canada and allow for fairer competition within the Canadian experience class. Learning from this process, it was significantly improved. Are there any aspects that remain unclear? Not entirely. The online, yes, this was an incredible initiative. What did you like about this engagement process? I kept this pretty short. I appreciated the opportunity to submit a lengthy submission through an email as part of this engagement process. I also appreciate the process was open to anyone to provide their feedback. I really do appreciate that. And it was, I'll also mention here, it was thorough and robust. I would love to see more of this public consultation efforts. I guess that would be in the improve. What would I not like? But I was not satisfied with the lack of public advertisement. You guys know I follow IRCC and Sean Fraser and Twitter, and I was not satisfied with the lack of public advertisement for the engagement process. As a lawyer, well, I'm not a lawyer. As a consultant, but I mean, I'm sure lawyers and consultants are also frustrated that they were not notified. With years of experience in the immigration system, our perspective is valuable and relevant to this process. It was only 4 days ago that I became aware of this stakeholder engagement forum, and it was through a nonprofit organization because they know how into immigration I am, and they said, "Steve, are you aware of this?" And I was not. So the short timeline for submitting a response before January 8th did not allow me sufficient time to gather and include relevant data and numbers to support my statements and hypotheses. While these statements are based on my personal opinion, I believe they are factually accurate. However, given more time, I would have liked the opportunity to further substantiate and develop my ideas. Do you have any changes or further recommendations that could support your participation in future years? I would love the opportunity. I would love to be notified whenever a public consultation becomes available through IRCC. Do you agree to have your written submission published in whole or in part? Yes, absolutely. I believe in transparency. How would you like the material to be attributed in subsequent reports? Full attribution. Go for it. It's done.